What would you think if I told you that one of the most delicate, most obedient queens in all of history was already a wife before she could speak in full sentences, and a mother before she'd ever held a doll long enough to know what it meant to play? She was 5 when they placed the crown of expectation on her tiny head. 5 when the ink dried on a marriage contract that would bind her to a man 3 times her age. One she did not know and would never come to understand. And by the time she turned 11, she had already bled her first shame, been prepared in secret chambers by women with quiet hands, and delivered a child that would never call her mother, because the court would not allow it. They called it an alliance. They called it tradition. They called it fate. But she never called it anything. She did not have the words. She only had eyes that rarely blinked, and a stillness that made even the statues in the chapel seem too animated. The girl was born into a kingdom that measured worth in bloodlines and wombs. If you believe that behind every crown lies a curse, subscribe to our channel, where history bleeds through silence. Her father, a weary king grown paranoid by his thinning line, had spent years sifting through noble families like a butcher assessing livestock. He found her mother, a pale duchess of royal descent with good hips and a quiet tongue, and declared her suitable. Their daughter was born during a winter storm that buried half the kingdom in silence. Her first breath came between lightning strikes. The midwife claimed she did not cry, only opened her mouth as if tasting the world, then closed it as if unimpressed. She grew without joy. The nursery was a place of velvet and echoes, where servants whispered in corners and tutors taught her more about etiquette than dreams. She learned how to nod before she learned how to laugh. She learned how to bow before she learned how to run. And even her games were rehearsals. How to walk into a room like a queen. How to pour tea without trembling. How to sit so still the men in robes would believe she'd been born sacred. At 3, she was engaged. The announcement was made with roses and bells. The bells tolled not for celebration, but as if warning the soil of what was coming. She met her husband-to-be at 5. He was a man with wet eyes and dry fingers, a prince who smiled without showing teeth. He gave her a pearl comb. She gave him a flower she'd crushed in her fist out of nervousness. That evening, her governess was slapped for allowing her to show a stem with wilted petals. The wedding came 6 months later. She wore white, not because she was pure, but because the dressmaker insisted the lace caught candlelight better. She did not understand the vows. She only repeated what they told her, to honor and obey. The words felt strange in her mouth, like foreign coins she wasn't allowed to spend. No one told her what the marriage meant. Not really. They told her she was a princess, now a queen in title. They told her she would make her country proud. They told her she was special. But she watched the way the older women looked at her. Sadly, quietly, the way one watches an animal being led gently toward a place where no return is possible. And she understood, without understanding. That night, she did not sleep. Her chambers were filled with flowers, white lilies, pale roses. The scent clung to her skin like the touch of unfamiliar hands. She curled into a ball beneath layers of silk and gold thread and whispered to her pillow, "I want to go home." There was no reply. There never would be. She was moved to a separate wing after that. The Queen's Wing, they called it. It had 7 windows and no view. The curtains remained drawn. The women who dressed her no longer smiled. They touched her with care, but not warmth. She asked one of them, once, if she could go outside. The woman didn't answer, only tied the corset tighter. The seasons passed, but no one marked her birthdays. At 6, she began bleeding from her nose in the cold mornings. At 7, she was instructed in the ways of wifely devotion. She did not know the meanings of the diagrams. She did not understand the purpose of the oils. She only knew that every lesson left her feeling smaller, as if her body was a thing to be prepared, not lived in. By 8, she knew to never cry in public. By 9, she knew how to hold her breath through pain. By 10, she stopped asking questions. And by 11, her belly swelled, quietly, as if the shame itself had learned to grow without a sound. The palace wrapped her in silence. No announcements were made, no celebrations arranged. The courtiers who had once admired her delicate posture and porcelain skin now walked more quickly through the halls. Their eyes glanced past her without landing, as though she were not a child growing a child, but a shadow trailing the hem of a cursed prophecy. She was kept away from the public wing entirely. Her lessons stopped. Her governess vanished. The servants who came to her chamber now wore faces carved from stone. They changed her linens without speaking. They brought her food and took it away untouched. Only one midwife remained by her side. An older woman with hands like leather and eyes like wet coal, who whispered songs from an older time, a time before thrones and rituals and treaties written in uterine blood. The girl, the queen, the vessel, watched her belly grow with quiet horror. She didn't understand. Not truly. She hadn't yet learned how to speak of what was happening, only how to endure it. Her body ached in ways she couldn't describe. The pressure in her ribs, the soreness in her hips, the constant, heavy pull in her spine that made it hard to breathe. She began walking with a slight limp, and every time her ankles swelled, the nursemaid would mutter something under her breath about the sins of kings. She was 11 years old. She had never held a book of poetry. She had never played with other children. She had never known what it meant to choose anything. And now her body was opening, hour by hour, to something she could not name. The palace doctors came once, only once. They examined her as though she were livestock. They spoke in Latin. One of them touched her stomach and nodded. Another frowned. The third scribbled notes on a scroll, as if what he wrote would survive longer than her. They left without looking her in the face. Her husband visited once, too. He stood in the doorway, fingers clasped behind his back. He did not speak to her. He looked at her belly, then at the floor, then turned and left. The next day, the nurses replaced her bed with one lower to the ground. They began washing her with herbs that smelled like iron and vinegar. Winter came. The windows were sealed against the cold. Fires burned around the clock in her chamber. But she was always cold. Her skin lost color. Her eyes grew glassy. She would wake from shallow sleep with a gasp, heart pounding, as though she were drowning in dreams she could not remember. And then, on a night when the wind howled like something wounded, the pain began. It started in her back, a dull, wet pressure, like her bones were being twisted from the inside. It spread quickly. Her stomach tightened, convulsed. She vomited. She cried out, a soft, pathetic sound that no one answered at first. But the midwife came. She always came, and with her, blood came too. They laid her on linen sheets, sheets that would never be used again. She bit her lip until it bled, screamed once, then not again. Her fingers clawed the mattress. Her legs shook. She sobbed like a creature, not like a queen. And through it all, the midwife whispered, over and over, "Almost done, little one, almost there." Hours passed. The baby was born just before dawn, slick and quiet. Too quiet. The girl reached for it, her arms weak, trembling, but they did not give it to her. They wrapped it in cloth and took it from the room before she could see if it had her nose, her lips, her eyes, before she could know if it was a boy or a girl, before she could even decide if she wanted to know. And then they cleaned her, stitched her, laid her back against the damp sheets. No one said congratulations. No one said thank you. She lay awake until the sun crept through a crack in the curtain and landed on the floor beside her bed. That was the first time she asked the question out loud, voice dry and thin. "Am I alive?" The nursemaid didn't answer, because the truth was too cruel to speak. Yes, she was alive, but she would never be a child again. She stayed in that room for 6 more weeks. No visitors, no names, no songs. The fire burned low and the food came cold. She barely touched it. Her body had begun to shrink around the hollowness, like the walls of the palace curling away from its eastern wing. Her arms thinned. Her cheeks fell in. Her skin looked translucent in the morning light, like she was beginning to fade from the inside out. Sometimes she would wake and think she was somewhere else, a monastery, a tomb, a cradle. Sometimes she'd forget her age. Was she 11, or was she only made to look like someone who had once been? The midwife didn't answer questions anymore. She only hummed and checked the bandages. The stitches were healing, but the ache remained, a pulsing ache, low in her spine, like a secret knocking that would never be let in. She began to dream, not of fields or meadows. She had never seen one. Not of childhood. She'd never had one. But of corridors with no end, and voices that whispered things she could never remember when she woke. Sometimes she saw herself in the dream, but older, sometimes younger, always silent, always dressed in white that was slowly being stained red. They brought her the news one afternoon. A court advisor entered the chamber, flanked by 2 pale-faced women, and read a decree. Her husband, the king, he had ascended to full rule. She was now queen consort. He had named their child a prince. She was not mentioned, not even as mother. No portrait was commissioned, no celebration held in her honor. The child was to be raised under proper supervision, they said, in another wing, by other women, by the ones who had studied theology and etiquette, not grief. She wasn't told where he was. She wasn't told when he would walk. She wasn't told what they named him. She was only told she had done her duty, and now she must rest. They moved her that night to a smaller chamber. No windows, only one door, a pale yellow canopy over the bed, like a halo in a room without light. Her clothes were folded and placed in a trunk. She was given simpler gowns, no embroidery, no lace. The crown, child-sized, golden, beaded with rubies, was taken away. She didn't ask where they put it, because she already knew. It was not hers anymore. It had never really been. She walked the hallways in the dark after that, barefoot, careful. She learned which floorboards groaned, which walls listened. Once, she reached the chapel and found it empty. She sat in the last pew and waited. For what? She didn't know. She prayed, not with words, but with silence. A kind of mourning that doesn't sound like crying. A kind of longing so old it has no voice left. By the time she turned 12, she no longer wept. The tears had dried into her bones. A new girl arrived one day, 10 years old, from a northern court, sent for fostering, they said, a companion for the queen, but the queen did not want companions. She did not speak to the girl, but she watched. The way the new girl still played with ribbons, still laughed when her braids came undone, still asked questions with no fear of the answers. She watched her as if watching a ghost. The girl asked once, "Is it true you were married when you were 5?" She nodded. Did it hurt? She didn't answer. The girl didn't ask again. Time crawled, the seasons turned, and still, no one spoke her name aloud. She was not Queen Maria, not Lady Maria, not mother, not daughter. She was something else now. Not forgotten, just unseen. Like furniture too heavy to move, but too haunted to sit in. She began writing her name in the condensation on the window glass, sometimes backward, sometimes upside down, as if trying to make it new, as if trying to see if it could mean something else. But it never did. It was just a name, a child's name, left behind. The years passed, but she remained 13. Not in age, but in spirit, suspended. Her body moved forward. It changed, slowly, predictably. Her face lost its roundness. Her voice deepened to a quiet steadiness that startled the few who heard it. But inside she lived in that locked chamber, in the shape of a girl who once cried without knowing why. She saw her son once, only once. By accident, she had wandered further than she should have, chasing the sound of music, a harp, delicate and hesitant, as though plucked by someone still learning to touch beauty. She stepped into a hall she hadn't seen before, long and narrow, lined with windows. And there he was, a boy in velvet, standing still, staring at a bird in the garden beyond the glass. She knew him, not by his face. He didn't resemble her, not by the way he stood, too upright, too practiced, but by something in his stillness. The same kind of stillness she'd once held under lace and obligation. She didn't move, didn't breathe. He turned, just slightly, sensing something. His gaze passed her. He looked through her, past her, as if she were air. He said nothing. He walked away. She stayed in the hallway long after the harp went silent. She didn't follow, didn't ask, because there was nothing left to ask. He didn't know her name. That much was clear. They said he was bright, that he read in 3 languages, that he had a gift for arithmetic, that he asked clever questions at council meetings, that the priests called him blessed. She listened, not out of pride, but from a strange, aching curiosity. Like a bird hearing the sound of wings it would never grow. By 15, she was a woman in form, but still kept behind doors meant for broken things. She was not allowed to sit at court, not allowed to attend mass with the others. She had a private confessor, a private chapel, a private dining hour. Privacy was a word they used to mean containment. Sometimes she wondered if she had died that night, when the child was born. And everything since had been a performance, a slow, quiet haunting of her own body. There were visitors from other kingdoms, princes, ambassadors. They came and went. She was never introduced, never dressed for the banquets, never summoned to the ballrooms. The girl from the north had grown, too, taller now, with a voice like thunder in a young storm. She asked more questions, grew restless. She began demanding answers. Why do they keep you hidden? Why don't you leave? Why don't you fight? She had no answers to give, because the truth was simple and brutal. She didn't know how, not how to leave, not how to speak, not how to believe she was still someone worth rescuing. But something inside her stirred. Not anger, that would come later. This was older, slower, like the feeling of cold creeping under a door, like the soft groan of a rope pulled too tight, too long. She began to walk differently, more deliberately. She asked the maid to stop tying her corset so tightly. She started choosing her own clothes, dark colors, simple sleeves, high collars. One day, she refused to have her hair curled. "No one sees me," she said, "so let it fall." And they let it. They let her, because by now, even the servants had forgotten who she was supposed to be. And that forgetting, that empty space, was her freedom. No one asked where she went at night. No one stopped her when she wandered the unused halls. And that was how she found the room. It had no name, no candles, no scent. Just a locked door that wasn't locked. Inside were trunks, dozens of them, and letters, drawings, clothes too small for any woman, and a crown, tiny, child-sized, dusted with years. The rubies had dulled. She didn't touch it. She only sat beside it. For hours, not crying, just remembering what no one else had, that she had once been someone. She returned to that room every night, not to mourn, that ritual had passed, not to rage, that storm had burned out long ago, but to exist, quietly, in the shape of her former self. She would sit on the stone floor beside the child's crown, a piece of silk wrapped around her shoulders like memory made tangible. Sometimes she would read the letters, messages from a mother she could not remember to a daughter she would never know. Sometimes she would simply close her eyes and count her own breaths. In the darkness of that forgotten chamber, she began to feel something she had never been given in life. A name, not the one embroidered on birth records or signed onto marriage scrolls, not the one whispered by courtiers or printed in ledgers, but a name only she knew, a name forged in pain, bound in silence, and carried without ceremony. It sounded like nothing, and yet it was everything. She began to write, on scraps, on margins of books she borrowed and never returned. Words without flourish, sentences like wounds. She wrote about stillness, about cold rooms and warm hands that never came, about a child given to a kingdom and taken from herself. She folded the pages and hid them in the hem of old curtains, in the lining of trunks, between the pages of dusty hymnals. She did not write to be remembered. She wrote to mark her existence, like scratches on the inside of a locked door. By 17, she no longer flinched when people entered the room. By 18, she could walk the entire West Wing without anyone asking her name. She had become part of the furniture, a silent figure, a faded silhouette, too elegant to be dismissed, too strange to be embraced. But even in shadows, life does not vanish. It waits. There came a day, quiet as snowfall, when her son passed her in the corridor again. Older now, 12, maybe 13. He turned his head as he walked, curious, uncertain. Their eyes met. She smiled. He didn't know why. He said nothing. But he remembered the face. Years later, when he became king, he searched the palace for the woman with the sad smile. They told him she had died years ago. He nodded, but he didn't believe them, because no ghost had ever looked that alive. She did die eventually, not in a bed of roses, not in ceremony, but alone, in the same room where her crown had been kept. A servant found her seated on the floor, her back against the wall, her eyes open but unseeing. There was a letter in her hand. It read only, "I forgive you, and I remember myself." They buried her in the royal crypt. No fanfare, no eulogy. Her tomb bore no title, just a name, and the dates of a life that history had once tried to erase. But her story remained, in rumors, in silence, in little girls who ask why queens never smile in their portraits, in boys who dream of mothers they never knew, and in the wind that moves through corridors no one walks anymore. If this story made you feel something history tried to hide, subscribe. Because we don't just tell stories. We uncover what power tried to forget, and we let the forgotten speak again.